welcome back to the Matthew Shiner podcast. This is the cap I wore on the night of my 8th grade graduation. By that simple fact alone, you now have something with which to associate it with. It has meaning now to you. But to me, it has different meaning. It symbolizes a time, a place, and a particular night. That being said, it is also a transitional piece, something that, with this time, with that night, everything has changed. Because the way I looked at myself, at the building, at the people in the building, at the times I had there, at the friends I made, the way in which I looked at them radically changed with that night. And in a way with this hat, and this is a metaphor that I'm trying to use to illustrate the Eucharist, you see, to me, this thing has a radically different meaning than that which I gave you. Why? Because I was there to witness firsthand these events, these thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And very well, the people who were there that night, the parents, students, teachers, had similar feelings. But you would not have these same feelings because you were not there that night. You may be asking, how does this relate to the Eucharist? And I will get to that in a minute. This is a photo from my first communion. Like so many people, I received first communion in 2nd grade. And like so many, I believe that I was well unprepared for receiving the sacrament. Now, my attitude towards the Eucharist has changed since then. Of course, that is to be expected from most people. Most people will learn and grow, and therefore the way they believe and see things will radically change as time goes by. Either because they grow in knowledge or because their sense and perception have changed in some other shape. But for me, it has been a more radical change. I cannot recall well what I was thinking then, though I can kind of imagine. It was more of a chance in who I was in becoming more of an adult. Now I could share in what my parents and so many others had shared in here at Mass. That brings me to two interesting stories. First off, when I was in CCD class, when I was in 2nd grade, and our teacher asked us what we thought about Jesus, to give us words to describe Jesus, and the obvious came up. God, wonderful, amazing, incredible, etc., etc. But the word that came to my mind was, word that my uncle used very often, sick. And the teacher promptly wrote that on the board. The second was actually receiving communion past the first communion day. And because I was so short, many Eucharistic ministers would not allow me to receive, which led to many moments when an adult behind me or my parents would have to vouch that, yes, indeed, this little kid was at the age of reason. Now, the reason I find it so necessary to speak on the Eucharist is a video that Brian Holdsworth published yesterday, speaking about a new study on the Eucharist. And what Brian says, I believe, is very important. But before, I want to talk a little more about the Eucharistic belief. I want to share my personal experiences with Eucharistic reverence. When we received our new assistant pastor at my parish, there was something noticeably different about him, than other priests I'd met before. Besides his nice vestments, though in this photo I'm showing here on video, this is not one of his vestments, this is one he was using as a guest priest that he wore for Mass, there was a certain action that he had towards the Eucharist, and that was the way in which he held his fingers after the consecration. That is, the canonical digits. Besides this, there were many other differences that he had about the Eucharist. He would genuflect at the beginning and end of Mass, something that not many priests of that time did. This priest also encouraged Holy Mass in another important way, incense. The smells and bells are something that he encouraged. In fact, it is because of him that I grew to know and appreciate the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite. His attitude and reverence and respect toward tradition made me look into tradition. And on top of that, he also invited me to a solemn high Mass in a monastery that he would be serving as deacon as. That he introduced me to using the term smells and bells. The weekend before I attended that Mass, I attended my first Latin Mass, which was a low Mass at a local FSSP apostolate that at the time was a standalone parish. Besides this, as I mentioned, besides his attitude towards the Eucharist and the liturgy, he also encouraged the smells and bells. Our parish has always used the bells, even when I first came during the last year of the pandemic. As well, incense was something that we used sparsely. At the time, we had a seminarian at our parish, featured here as well in the picture, kneeling, he's a deacon, who, during the Easter Triduum, he would serve as feorither. But when Father Brian came, incense became a more common occurrence, especially for larger feast dates, so on certain Sundays and other occasions we would have incense for Mass. Why do I bring this up? Because of the care and respect that this priest brought into the liturgy. He made me question, why is it that we do these things? Because of this, I began to learn more about my faith. More than this, I think the questions we must ask is, why do we do these things? Why do we have the bells and incense, the smells and bells? Why do we give the Eucharist such reverence? For me, this is a question of the liturgy, and the liturgy before the Second Vatican Council organically developed from the time of the Apostles until the 1962 Missal. Things were added and adapted as time went on. Core elements of the Mass, like the Roman canon, existed before the codification of the Missale Romanum, or Roman Missal, of the Council of Trent, the Tridentine Mass. Before this, the Mass or Missal used for Mass was ratified by local bishops or ordinaries. For example, the Mass in England, as opposed to the Mass in France, would have been approved by regents, approved by bishops. The Mass in its essence would be the same, including many of the same parts, but would differ in certain trivial matters. This was until the Council of Trent, when one singular missal was approved for all the realms and places throughout the world, throughout the Roman Rite of the Church. The Mass since then has only little changed until, however, it must be noted that any development from before and after the Council, that being from the time of Christ or the early Church until the Council, that development was organic. However, the Second Vatican Council introduced an inorganic development into the liturgy. It took a lot of the Mass and stripped it. As some more liberal theologians put it, they, quote, removed the boring parts of the Mass. Core elements of the Mass remain, including the Roman canon. However, it has been marked as an option among a list of others, rather than as the core and heart of the Mass, as it was once known. All that being said, the essence of the Mass, the core of the Mass, what makes the Mass, has never changed. Because what makes the Mass in the liturgy, is what is done in the Mass in the liturgy. That being said, there are a few important words and actions that must be said. The reason we need to foster good and holy liturgies is because of the real presence of Christ. That makes the Mass the Mass. The reason that one might use the canonical digits is a sign of respect for the real presence of Christ. The reason a priest, or even someone like I, a lay Eucharistic minister, in fact, I would encourage anyone who is to distribute the Eucharist to do thusly. The reason this is done is to ensure that no particles of the Blessed Sacrament may fall or be left. I like to think of it this way. What is something that after touching it, you would not want to touch something else? For me, that example is raw meat. Even though you cannot see the bacteria when you touch raw meat, you try not to touch something so as not to spread the bacteria to other surfaces, as not to get someone else or yourself sick. Or in technology, when you open something like an old hard drive, you have to do such things in a clean room because even a speck of dust can ruin the whole operation. The reason we give respect to something is because we care for it. If we believe the Eucharist is truly Jesus, then we truly ought to give it the highest amount of respect. This includes the attitudes of the ministers who administer the Eucharist, the ordinary and extraordinary ministers. Extraordinary ministers ought to live up to the name extraordinary. What they administer is something extraordinary, something beyond the ordinary. Their duty, too, is extraordinary. These extraordinary ministers have as much, if not more, respect for the Eucharist. They should have more or the same respect as the priest who celebrates it. So many times for Eucharistic ministers, these things become ordinary. This is the same for priests as well as the Eucharistic ministers. Their attitude towards giving the Eucharist to the people becomes so lax. It is merely something that they continually repeat, the body of Christ, the body of Christ, the body of Christ. They do not put much thought into it. Their attitude and demeanor towards the Eucharist become lax, and they don't show the Eucharistic belief they ought to have. Therefore, I ask Eucharistic ministers, do not let the Eucharist become routine. You should give care and respect when you give it. Our priest, the one I was talking about before, gives extra care into the cleaning of the vessels following the distribution of communion. This is respect for the Eucharist, to make sure that no particle remains, that the Eucharist is not merely tossed aside or left to remain. This is a part of Eucharistic reverence. We should make sure that hosts do not fall, so as not to leave particles where Christ is present, and then we should take care that any remaining particles are taken care of. What we behold is not mere bread, it is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. Therefore extra care should be taken to it. This is the same for the people as well. They should have deep care and respect and reverence for the Eucharist. This is why so many people receive the Eucharist on the tongue. First of all, because this is what the Church teaches as the ordinary means for reception of the Eucharist. And second, I like the analogy that Brian Holdsworth gave about the Eucharist and reception on the hand. When you go to a store and get change, for those of the 5 of you who still pay cash, you hold out your hands. Or if you're a 5-year-old getting candy from your grandparent or something, like this, like candy here, you hold out your hand. That being said, this act of holding out a hand to receive something is something ordinary. Therefore, for many people, the way in which we receive the Eucharist should be extraordinary. so they therefore receive the Eucharist in the tongue. This is a way in which the church has organically developed, as I mentioned before about organic development, that people should receive the Eucharist. I also want to mention that Brian said that bells at the consecration also lead to an increased belief in the Eucharistic presence. Organic development is a natural thing that supports belief. We should encourage good and holy liturgy in order that belief of the people would be encouraged to what the Church really believes about the Eucharist. When our liturgy supports that the Eucharist is worthy of respect and reverence, then people will believe that the Eucharist is the body, blood, of Jesus, and worthy of respect and reverence. Think back to the example I gave at the beginning. When I explained to you what the hat means, to me, you understood what it meant. That is the same with the Eucharist. In the same, as Dr. Scott Hahn similarly put it in his Rome Sweet Home, and as I personally believe, the Eucharist, and not necessarily papal doctrine, is the hill upon which Catholicism dies or stands. Because if Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist, then the Church must be his body and dwelling place, and therefore true. However, if not, then Catholics are idolaters who worship bread. I want to say something important. Traditionalist Catholics should not and do not believe they are better merely because they receive on the tongue, or have a more holy and reverent liturgies, or attend the TLM. Rather, it is that they believe that this is the right way to worship Christ. And for that fact, Mass and worship is not a matter of opinion, as so many put it. The Church gives us ways to worship God that are proper. Therefore, too, it is not a matter of the facts. It is a matter of the facts that tell us what is the way to do the liturgy, as Brian Holdsworth spoke about. But it is also what the Church tells us, what is traditional, and also how we should show respect and reverence for what is truly deserving of our respect, reverence, and worship, and that is Jesus, present in the Blessed Sacrament. That is what I want to encourage you, to receive the Eucharist worthily, having the right mindset to it. For those of you who serve in Mass, to also have the right mindset. For those of you who are liturgists in charge of the liturgy, I also want you to encourage fostering good liturgical practices, and also for Eucharistic ministers to have a proper mindset for the service that you are called to. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Doing so helps us to spread this Catholic and Christian message to all. Please also consider supporting this channel on